Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Kate Epstein about her book titled Analog Superpowers: How 20th Century Technology Theft Built the National Security State, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2024, which takes us through some really interesting history, starting at the beginning of the 20th century, when we've got British inventors who are solving military questions that involve all sorts of complicated maths that mainly are about trying to shoot things at other things, specifically guns from battleships with like waves moving things around. As soon as you start to think about it, you realize, oh yeah, that probably would have been quite a tricky problem to solve. But they did it. And the Admiralty was really excited because obviously this solves a lot of problems for navies. However, who gets to own technology like this? How does technology gets transferred from an innovation to a navy, from one navy to another navy, as we're going to talk about? There's a lot of really interesting history and politics here. So, Kate, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Miranda. I'm excited to be here.
I'm very pleased to have you, but before we get into all the exciting things of the book itself, could you give us a bit of a introduction of you and the backstory? Why did you decide to write this book?
Sure. I've always been interested in the history of war for reasons I couldn't begin to explain. I don't come from a military family, but my father read a lot of history when I was growing up. And it eventually was suggested to me that it was something I could pursue professionally. And so I studied military history in graduate school and kind of fell backwards into what became my principal interest, which is not naval technology per se, although that's obviously a huge part of what I write about. It was actually never kind of technology that really captured my imagination about the history of war. It was more the human drama, which isn't what I ended up writing about principally. But what really fascinated me working on my dissertation was the relationship between intellectual property rights and national security secrecy. And I wrote this book actually. It was one of those things where I thought I was going to write an article, and one thing led to another, as it often does. But it was triggered, so to speak, by reading a law review article about the history of the state secrets privilege in the United States, which is a privilege that allows the executive branch of the government, or it can be asserted by the executive branch, to decline to disclose evidence in judicial proceedings that it says would endanger national security secrets. And in the footnote of this law review article, I saw a reference to a case called Pollen and Isherwood v. Ford Instrument Company. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I know these names, Pollen and Isherwood, but I knew them from the pre-World War I British naval context. I knew them as inventors of gunnery, fire control technology, fire control meaning the control of gunfire, aiming. And I thought, well, what on earth are they doing in an American legal case from the 1930s? And I thought, well, let me investigate. And like I said, it began life as an article and turned into a book. So that's kind of where the genesis came from.
Well, I can hear from that foundation story sort of a number of threads that have ended up in the finished book. So I'm intrigued to kind of trace them through our conversation as we go. But I think we do have to start with that kind of human side of things before we get into the secrecy and the laws and kind of what happens to it. You talk, obviously, that this book is kind of primarily centered on these innovations around shooting guns from ships. So
Yes.
the people behind that, can you introduce us to these British guys? Who were they? Where did they come from? Why did they decide to tackle this problem?
Absolutely. So, actually, one of the nice things about this book was that it did actually have some human drama, which, well, no one accused my first book of having excessive human interest, but this one has, I think, actual characters and an actual human story. So, the two sort of pioneering inventors of the first modern fire control system were these English civilians named Arthur Pollen and Harold Isherwood. Arthur Pollen came from a prominent, socially well-connected English Catholic family. He had gone to Cardinal Newman's Oratory School, then to Oxford, and had several family members in the British Royal Navy, and kind of fell into this question, became fascinated by the question of how do you hit a moving target when your own ship is moving in 3 dimensions. And he was the managing director of a company called the Linotype Company, which manufactured these really rather remarkable machines called linotypes, which it's short for line of type. So they were newspaper printing equipment makers. The linotype machine actually basically made possible Lord Northcliffe's sort of penny printing empire. Couldn't have turned out so many newspapers so quickly without it. And so that gave Pollen a background in industry, gave him some familiarity with patent law, because the British Linotype Company manufactured under license from an American company, and familiarized him with the manufacture of really complex, quite precision engineered machinery. Harold Isherwood had a different background. He was born in Manchester, and I found this out about him using Ancestry.com, which I'd never used as a research tool before, but very little was known about this guy, and so I thought, let me give it a try. And still don't know as much as I'd like to, but know more than I did. And he went to a technical school, became really quite well respected. Clearly, as an engineer, you can tell that from the people who proposed him when he wanted to join, I forget the exact name, but the Institution of Mechanical Engineers during World War I. And just an exceptionally talented designer and engineer. He was called a genius by a very prominent instruments maker and scientist himself named Charles Vernon Boys. So I sort of defer to Boys's judgment there. And so that was these two, their backgrounds. Isherwood worked as an engineer at the Linotype Company, which is how he and Pollen came into contact. And they both, starting around 1901, just became obsessed by this question and dedicated to solving it. So a really kind of interesting duo. They seem to have played very well off of each other. Pollen, as I say, the more socially prominent, the better connected, and Isherwood bringing to the partnership just these extraordinary design and engineering talents.
Hmm. Well, I admit I am not an extraordinary engineer, like Isherwood was, and Pollen clearly was, at least to some extent. So perhaps without going too far into the mathematics, can you help us get a sense of the solution that they came up with to this problem?
Sure. So, for better or for worse, I am also not an extraordinary engineer. I ran fleeing from my math and science classes and
Oh,
in
good. It's not
college
just me.
as quickly as I could. Yeah, I saw that you went to Yale, and I placed out of my math and science distribution requirements at Yale in part by taking a class fondly known as physics for poets. Um,
Yep. I did the political economy of AIDS in Africa, which
oh,
was a
I did
lot more emphasis on public health than math.
indeed.
Yep.
I did one on global population problems as
Hmm.
well.
Okay. So
Yes,
we're historians. Let's
indeed.
think about this
Um,
mathematical solution then from a historical point of view.
Historical point of view, and actually, it's one of these things where I kind of have to explain it to myself with small words and sock puppets.
Well, we don't have
I
sock puppets in this, purely audio
I
medium, but
understand. I understand. But so you have, I guess, maybe two sides of the problem. One is that you're trying to hit a target that is increasingly far away from you at this point in time and moving increasingly faster, thanks to technological change. in ship construction and ship propulsion. So, it was not by the time of World War I, a range of 5 miles between the firing ship and the target ship was not uncommon and not unexpected. So that's hard. So what it means is that in the late 19th century, really for hundreds of years, when navies had engaged, you didn't have to worry about kind of predicting where the target was going to be when the shell actually landed on it. The ranges were so close that it was just kind of point and shoot. You laid your gun flat to the surface of the ocean, waited for the ship to be at the point in its roll from side to side that it was flat, and you just fired. So one problem that comes in is this prediction problem. How do you actually figure out where the target ship is going to be at the time a shell is actually going to land on it? And then the other side of the problem is that you yourself are moving. You're moving on a course at a certain speed, and your ship is also rolling, pitching, and yawing. So roll, as I said, is from side to side. Pitching is the movement from front to back. And yawing is the sort of corkscrewing motion that a ship makes. And that's all due to wave action. You can imagine a sort of, a rubber ducky in a bathtub, being moved around if you sort of slap the surface of the water. So you have to find a way to neutralize the effects of roll, pitch, and yaw, because that'll throw off the aim of your gun. And you have to figure out how, in effect, to neutralize the effect of relative motion, the relative motion between your ship and the fire and the target ship. So part of what made Pollen and Isherwood so unique is that they actually tried to define the parameters of this mathematical problem as comprehensively as they could. So they were not content with kind of piecemeal solutions or kind of rough and ready instruments. They wanted something that was as systematic as possible and as precise as possible, because that's what they thought was going to be necessary to enable hits under combat conditions rather than under practice conditions. So what their mathematical analysis taught them was that the rate at which the range between the firing ship and the target ship, the rate at which the range was changing was typically not constant. So it's not that the ships, say, move 100 yards farther apart from each other each minute. Rather, the rate at which they move farther apart or closer together is changing constantly. It's changing from instant to instant. So the way I explained it to myself was through high school physics. It's kind of like the difference between speed and acceleration. So speed is, it's you're moving at 60 miles per hour, but when you're accelerating, you're moving 60 miles per hour 1 second, 62 the next second, 63, and so forth. So the speed is actually changing from instant to instant, which is why, at least in my high school, we did physics at the same time we did calculus, because that moves you. What calculus does is differentials and integration. Differentials, instantaneous time, and integration, infinite time. So essentially what Pollen and Isherwood realized was that they were going to need to build a machine that could do calculus, that could calculate the changing rate at which the range was changing instantaneously, not for a finite period of time. They also realized that the same thing was happening with the bearing. The bearing is the angle between your own ship's course and the line of sight to the target. And that, too, was changing instantaneously from moment to moment, not at a constant rate. And they also realized that the range rate, the rate at which the range was changing, and the bearing rate, the rate at which the bearing was changing, that those two rates were interdependent. And so you actually needed to be calculating both rates simultaneously in order to accurately be calculating either of them simultaneously, either of them correctly, excuse me. So that's kind of the mathematical problem in a nutshell, is that if you can
Mhm.
figure out how to calculate those two rates correctly from instant to instant, you can essentially reproduce the problem of firing on land from one stationary target at another stationary target. You can effectively cancel out the effects of relative motion.
Mm.
But that's, calculus is harder to do conceptually and it's harder to do mechanically than basic algebra, which is, saying basically we would now call it data smoothing.
Mm.
If you want, you can basically pretend for in order to simplify a problem that, well, okay, we know the rate is changing from instant to instant, but for this 2-minute period, we're going to treat it as constant. And that might be good enough if your error tolerance is high, and you, for whatever reason, you don't mind the error that's introduced by that. But Pollen and Isherwood really minded the error that was introduced by that. And so they were determined to come up with something that could solve the calculus problem. They were also determined to come up with something that was gyro stabilized. So basically, they realized that the yaw of the ship, the corkscrewing motion of the firing ship, was going to throw off the calculation of the bearing angle between the firing ship and the line of sight to the target. And so they realized that they could use a gyroscope to basically it's this same basic notion as a gyro compass, or actually like inertial guidance systems in missiles. Basically, the gyroscope can maintain a kind of stable reference line, so that you, even if you're corkscrewing from side to side, the gyroscope essentially tells you what your real course is, and you can check the bearing angle against that real course rather than the corkscrewing course. So they were also very interested in gyro stabilization of their system from a very early stage. So I hope that's reasonably
Yeah.
clear.
No, I think that gives us a sense of it, and
Okay.
certainly gives us enough of a sense to understand why the Admiralty was so excited about this, and really wanted to make this something that they could use. Obviously, it's not as simple as just saying, "Hey guys, thanks, bye."
Right.
So, what agreement did they actually come up with? And can you sort of walk us through the risks for both sides of sort of coming to an agreement, and then kind of that will hopefully give us the context of like understanding why this agreement seemed like a good enough idea for both sides to, say they were going to go ahead with it.
Sure. So this is actually, it was something, my first book was about torpedo development. This was something that absolutely fascinated. That was kind of that was the moment at which my dissertation became interesting to me, actually, was when I realized that what was going on here was kind of in torpedo contracts, which raised some very similar problems, was really kind of negotiations about distributing risk and how to price it. So basically, just as you say, yeah, it's not a simple, straightforward matter of, hey guys, thanks. Um, what basically the Admiralty was accustomed to either developing new technology by itself in a publicly owned arsenal, or it was accustomed to buying finished products from the private sector. What it was not accustomed to doing was funding what we would now call R&D, research and development. It had actually turned down, sorry, not the Admiralty, but the British Post Office had actually turned down Alexander Graham Bell, of all people, for what we would now call a development contract, a contract to fund research and development. The whole British government was very uncomfortable with this kind of contract, and for very good reason, because it's fraught with risk in a way that buying a finished product from the private sector is not fraught with risk. You know what you're getting. There's, as I put it in the book, there's a material concreteness to the purchase, and there's a temporal finality the transaction is kind of over and done with when the product is delivered, and you know when it's going to be delivered, or you can have a very high degree of confidence when it's going to be delivered. So the Admiralty, for its part, when it's got these two inventors coming to it saying, hey, we have this really cool idea, but it's just in our heads. We think we've analyzed the problem in a way that no one has before, and we think we have some great ideas about how to build the machines that can actually carry out our mathematical analysis. We don't actually have them yet. They exist only in our heads, and in like the most sketchy way on paper. We don't have the money to do it by ourselves, so we need you to help us out. And so the Admiralty, is approached by the equivalent of snake oil salesmen all the time. So that's a concern. It's like, are these guys for real, or are they just kind of cranks? Another concern is that they are going to basically, in the course of a relationship with the Admiralty, where they're drawing not only on the Admiralty's money, but actually also on Admiralty knowledge, Admiralty advice about how to get the technology to work, that they, Pollen and Isherwood, the inventors, are going to take that knowledge and basically screw the Admiralty over, try to actually sell it abroad. So the Admiralty is very worried about those risks. Pollen and Isherwood are worried about kind of an inverse set of risks. One is that the British government, and particularly the Admiralty and the War Office, didn't have a great track record when it came to respecting the intellectual property claims of inventors. They had a reputation as thieves who would basically take private sector technology. And the process of even convincing the Admiralty to give them a contract is actually fraught with risk from that perspective, because they have to disclose something. So just as the Admiralty is worried that Pollen and Isherwood are going to run off with Admiralty knowledge, Pollen and Isherwood are worried that the Admiralty is going to run off with their knowledge. So they're each worried about theft. The other thing that Pollen and Isherwood are worried about is how to get sufficient protection for what they regard as the true scope of their invention, which may sound like it ought to have been straightforward, but it wasn't at all. So the conventional way to protect intellectual property in a machine is a patent. Lots of people did that. The problem from Pollen's and Isherwood's perspective is that the patent system required inventors to define the scope of their invention more narrowly than Pollen and Isherwood believed their invention warranted. So again, for reasons that it's like easy to understand and kind of sympathize with, patent system, wants to strike a balance. I know I'm anthropomorphizing the patent system, but patent system wants to strike a balance between incentivizing innovation by offering essentially temporary monopolies on inventions on the one hand, and not enclosing too much as property that really ought to be open to the public, ought to be part of the commons of knowledge. And so one of the rules of thumb in the patent system is there's a dividing line between discovery and invention. So you can patent things that you've invented. You can't patent things that you've discovered that basically exist in nature. And Pollen's and Isherwood's perspective, that was an artificial boundary. From their perspective, what was so pioneering about what they had done was actually the analysis, the mathematical analysis, the definition of the problem. They thought that was actually even more important than however, the mechanical embodiment of their analysis that they might settle on. So I talk in the book about their mathematical analysis as almost the algorithms or the software of what the invention, the hardware of the invention that they were proposing to build. And if you read about IP and computer technology today, you know that algorithms present real challenges in a digital computing context for intellectual property systems. So they're really nervous about patents. For various reasons, they couldn't take out what was known as a pioneer patent, which was a very unusual type of patent that allowed inventors to claim broader scope than for an ordinary patent, um, mainly because to get a pioneer patent, you had to establish yourself as a kind of heroic inventor. That's a term from a historian named Christine McLeod. You had to establish yourself as a heroic inventor in the public mind. And if you're trying to invent super duper top secret military technology, you don't want to carry out a publicity campaign. So that's off the table. There are things called secret patents in Britain, which is as much a contradiction in terms as it sounds. It's a full-fledged patent, which isn't actually open to the public. Patent actually means open. These aren't open to the public. But a secret patent is incompatible with a pioneer patent. So it would just have to be an ordinary patent with the normal limits. And so what Pollen and Isherwood decided, that kind of the least bad of their options, is a new thing called a development contract. Term doesn't even exist at the time because it's so unusual. But they think that if they sign a contract with the Admiralty, that will allow them to define the scope of their invention as broadly as they think it merits. But that too comes with risks, precisely because it's such a new type of contract and it requires such an adjustment in the Admiralty's normal ways of thinking, that it's risky too. They just decide that it's the lowest risk of the various options on the table before them. So that's kind of the balance of risks that the two parties are trying to navigate.
Okay, so I mean, the way you've explained it there, yes, all right, there's some risks and there's some changes of ways of thinking, but that seems maybe possible to be getting on with, except then you turn the page and turns out the Pollen's designs got plagiarized by the
Indeed.
Admiralty. And so that balance did not work.
Nope.
First off, how did they do the plagiarizing? Was it actually successful? And how did they try and justify this?
Yeah, so those are good and difficult questions. So the short answer is for listeners to read chapter 2, but to try to describe it relatively quickly. So Pollen and the Admiralty do negotiate a development contract in basically the fall of 1906. For various reasons, it's not actually formally signed until early 1908, after which point the Admiralty has actually essentially already decided they don't want the technology. But putting that aside, they do negotiate the contract. They reach a meeting of the minds, to borrow a legal phrase. But what happens is that there's personnel turnover at the Admiralty. The new people who come in don't know the history of the negotiations. They have all of the concerns that have been around from the start at the Admiralty about essentially the trustworthiness of Pollen and Isherwood. Are they going to take what the Admiralty learns and take what the Admiralty teaches them and sell it abroad? And so what happens is that a British naval officer named Frederick Dreyer, who joins the Naval Ordnance Department in the Admiralty in 1907, and who was a highly competent officer in certain ways, but was also perceived by his brother officers to have some character flaws, in essence. Dreyer basically becomes a rival inventor to Pollen and Isherwood. He has an insider position that they don't have. He's also as a result, able to influence the Admiralty's decision making about the relative merits of his system and the Pollen Isherwood system. So he has a fairly obvious conflict of interest. And he kind of piecemeal develops a system that, with each step, incorporates more of the capabilities of Pollen's and Isherwood's system, until finally he's got a system that it's almost like a knockoff purse, that you can buy. It's not going to be as nice as the real thing, but you can buy a knockoff purse of a designer purse for $5. And that's kind of what his system is like. It's not very successful because he never sat down the way Pollen and Isherwood did and tried to analyze the problem from the ground up. He was always kind of working within parameters set by the Royal Navy, he was essentially working within a very kind of honorable tradition within the Royal Navy Officer Corps and enlisted as well, of tinkering. So basically trying to make incremental improvements. He's what the historian Joel McKeer might call a micro inventor. Pollen and Isherwood weren't interested in incremental improvements. They wanted a quantum leap. They were macro inventors, so to speak. So Dreyer's system can do, kind of on paper, a lot of the things that Pollen's and Isherwood's can do, but it's not as well engineered as their system. And in particular, the computer that Dreyer puts in his system to try to mimic the computer in Pollen's and Isherwood's system isn't as effective. And just to explain that term, what Pollen and Isherwood had at the heart of their system was an extraordinarily sophisticated analog computer. So analog computers are computers. They're not digital computers. They work on different principles, but kind of imagine like gears and levers and cams, very Victorian steampunk sort of. And Pollen and Isherwood had finally invented one that allowed them to perform calculus. And the kind of general principle of their computer was well known in the art. To borrow a term from patent law, Lord Kelvin, for instance, had used a similar principle. But Isherwood's crowning achievement as an engineer was to overhaul the design of Kelvin's computer, to basically make it far more sophisticated and give it far more processing power. And Dreyer, because he never analyzed the problem from the ground up, never understood the centrality of bearings and bearing rate to the way that Pollen and Isherwood solved the fire control problem. So what they did was design a computer that could make the range and the bearing rates, which I mentioned at the beginning, calculate interdependently. So they created a feedback loop, in essence, between the calculation of those two rates. And that's what gave their computer the ability to auto-generate predictions, even when the firing ship lost sight of the target due to smoke or mist or so forth. And it was that ability to auto-generate predictions that led contemporaries to regard what they had done as a form of artificial intelligence. Someone called it a machine that uses intelligence. Dreyer didn't do that. The part of his computer that calculated bearing rate was not mechanically interconnected with the part of his computer that calculated range rate until the very final stage of his computer, which he had the breakthrough for, and actually his lead engineer had the breakthrough for shortly after learning of the way that Pollen and Isherwood had interconnected the calculation of the range and bearing rates. So the underlying limitation of Dreyer's system was that he had never sat down and tried to design something that could hit the target under the most challenging conditions of relative movement. Pollen and Isherwood had wanted to be able to do the most difficult thing from the start. And so Dreyer's system essentially limited the tactics um, that the Royal Navy could use, whereas the appeal of Pollen and Isherwood's system to the numerous naval officers and gunnery experts who supported it was that because they had tried to cancel out the effects of relative motion under the most difficult conditions they could imagine, basically the Royal Navy could maneuver in ways tactically that it couldn't maneuver using Dreyer's system. So Dreyer, I say in the book that he probably didn't infringe Pollen and Isherwood's patents. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me there's probably enough differences in mechanical detail between what he did and what Pollen and Isherwood did that it wouldn't constitute patent infringement. I liken it to literary plagiarism rather than mechanical infringement because it's very clear that he took in sort of design inspiration from what they did. But he just wasn't a very talented plagiarist. It's sort of like, when you read a student paper that, like, I don't know, uses Chat GPT or something, and you can spot it, from a million miles away, because there isn't sufficient sensitivity to voice and style. That's kind of like what Dreyer did.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like the most successful plagiarism as done by the British Navy. Why then was the US Navy more able to successfully plagiarize what Pollen was doing?
So I think it boils down to a couple reasons. One is that the pirate in chief on the American side was a much more talented designer and engineer than Dreyer was. So the lead American plagiarist was an engineer named Hannibal Ford, not to be confused with Henry Ford. And Ford, so far as I can tell, was genuinely talented. There was also a secret sauce to his talent when it came to fire control technology, which was that the U.S. Navy was funneling him information about Pollen and Isherwood's invention, which was a process that began actually shortly before World War I and then was completed during the war. And it's fascinating to watch in the documents, the Ford and the Navy, the U.S. Navy, actually initially made exactly the same mistake that Dreyer had made, which was not to understand the importance of bearings and bearing rate in Pollen and Isherwood's solution to the fire control problem. But you can actually see it dawn on them in late 1917. And Ford then actually incorporates that realization into his design far more successfully than Dreyer ever did. With Dreyer, the way Dreyer and Elphinstone kind of incorporate that insight is kind of jury-rigged, whereas Ford incorporates it much more organically into the design of his computer. So partly, I think it was that Ford had more talent than Dreyer did. The other is that institutionally, the U.S. Navy didn't have a conflict of interest the way that the Admiralty did over Dreyer. So there was no one in the U.S. Ford did not have a decision-making role within the U.S. Navy over fire control policy. That was made by fire control procurement decisions were made by naval officers without a conflict of interest. And those officers very clearly determined that Pollen's and Isherwood's system was superior in performance to Dreyer's. So they identified Pollen's system as the one that the Navy was going to target for plagiarism. They too, didn't see what they were doing as piracy. And I actually I didn't answer that part of your question about how did the Admiralty rationalize it. And I think the Admiralty's rationalization was a bit different. I think they constantly, I mean, they saw Pollen and Isherwood basically as they just couldn't wrap their minds around the thought that they were learning more from the civilians than the civilians were learning from people wearing the uniform. And so they were constantly worried that they were getting blackmailed by Pollen and Isherwood. And they had Dreyer, were relying on Dreyer for ostensibly neutral advice, which they weren't getting from him. On the U.S. Navy side, I think the record compares favorably in the sense that it's still piracy, no question. But it's piracy for more elevated reasons, which is that the U.S. Navy, like China today, it was just really hungry to climb the global power rankings. They were pretty ruthless when it came to the intellectual property claims of foreign nationals. And they could tell themselves, actually, the same way the Admiralty did, that Pollen's and Isherwood's invention consisted only of what they were able to patent. And what they were able to patent, as I said earlier, was much narrower than what they believed, I think with reason, to have been the actual scope of their invention. So the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. patent system actually facilitates this in various ways, even more than the British patent system did. The U.S. Navy could kind of patent like little incremental things, or U.S. inventors could, I should say, and kind of, I don't know, build, almost like accumulate a bunch of little claims that didn't actually infringe the kind of master conception of the technology that they were effectively plagiarizing, almost like hiving off bits of. So I think that's why the U.S. Navy was more successful and kind of how its rationalizations compared to the Admiralties.
That makes it, though, even more interesting then to understand that Pollen decided to take legal action against the US Navy, given what you said about the patent system kind of giving him sort of less leg to stand on, I suppose. So why did he decide to take this step? And why was his second attempt at bringing legal action against the US Navy more successful than his first?
Oh, it's actually his second attempt at legal action against the Royal Navy that's more successful than his first. He's never successful against the U.S. Navy.
Well, success in this case I'm defining pretty broadly, but can you help us understand why he even thought this was a good idea in either case? It doesn't sound like he's got a lot of options.
Yeah, I mean, he was in a really unenviable position. He was actually in a stronger position on the British side because of something the British government did in it's 19. They take the decision in 1918 to establish a royal commission to hear the claims of inventors who accused the government of having used their inventions during World War I without authorization or compensation. And the royal warrant establishing that royal commission gives it much greater discretion to consider claims that for inventions that weren't necessarily reduced to patented form. And so that gives Pollen a lot more leeway to kind of formulate a claim that captures the scope of what he had done and why what the Admiralty had done, even if it wasn't in the strictest of terms patent infringement, still constituted some form of piracy for which he deserved compensation. The first time he tries that in front of the Royal Commission, he fails. He gets nothing, in part because Dreyer was relied upon by the Commission as a disinterested expert witness and was never subjected to cross-examination. Pollen tries again a second time in 1925 and succeeds. It's not a 100% victory. He loses on part of his claim, but he succeeds on the more important part of his claim. And that was because Dreyer, as soon as Pollen lost his first claim, put in his own claim for a reward for his fire control system, which fundamentally restructured the legal terrain facing Pollen and Isherwood. It also helped Pollen and Isherwood that the new chairman of the Royal Commission was very devoted to judicial independence and did not like it when the Crown, on behalf of the Admiralty, asserted what was then known as Crown privilege, would now be called the public interest immunity, to try to prevent Pollen and Isherwood from seeing evidence that they needed to prove their claims. So the combination of judicial independence and the restructuring of the legal terrain, thanks to Dreyer's claim, meant that they succeeded the second time. In the U.S. system, or in the U.S. case, there were a couple things that stymied them. Probably the most important was what became known as the state secrets privilege, which was, I mentioned, I think at the start, it's this privilege that allows the executive branch to decline to produce evidence on the grounds that it would endanger national security. Sorry, it's a privilege the executive branch can assert, and technically the judiciary has to assent to it. And Pollen, when Pollen and Isherwood sued the U.S. government for patent infringement, which was all they could sue for, was the only remedy, and it wasn't a very good one. When they sued the U.S. government for patent infringement in 1937, the government asserted essentially an early form of the state secrets privilege and was able to block them from seeing the evidence that they would have needed to prove their case. When they turned to suing Hannibal Ford's company in district court, which was complicated for reasons that I won't go into, the scope of what they could sue for there was actually very narrow. The government actually got itself attached to the case, but this case between two private sector litigants, and once again asserted the state secrets privilege, and defeated the claim that way. So that's why it's really government secrecy is what it boils down to, that prevents them from making out their claim on the American side. They might have had a hard time even without the government secrecy claim, just because of the way the patent system restricted the scope of what they were able to claim for their invention. But they never even got that far, basically, because they never had access to the evidence.
So this is in fact something I wonder if we can zoom out, I suppose, a bit from the specifics of their case to put into some of this wider context, given obviously that government secrecy isn't just about their invention, it's a much,
Right.
much broader policy. Because this is also the time where we're really starting to talk about the military-industrial complex in the United
Right.
States, and law being one of the key elements of that. Can we draw any sort of direct lines between these cases, this particular invention, and that evolution of the military industrial complex?
Yeah, I think we can. I think the line would be even stronger with more case studies. And I think mine is you know, this is immodest, but pioneering in that respect. And I think to have more confidence in the conclusions, one would want more studies. But I think I've done enough in that book, and actually also in the Torpedo book, to make out a case that there's a kind of overlooked genealogy of the national security state in U.S. history and also in British history, which is rooted not in the clash between national security oriented governments and kind of sympathetic left wing protesters. One thinks, for instance, of like the British government going after Bertrand Russell, or the U.S. government going after the New York Times, where the civil liberties in question are freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so forth, which I think is the way we tend to conceptualize, what the national security state is. and who its opponents are. What I think I've done is show that sometimes the opponents of the national security state are actually defense contractors, because there's a tension between the intellectual property claims of contractors, which are backed by liberal norms of property and contract on the one hand, and the secrecy claims of national security states on the other hand. And so there's a line of cases. I've done in the torpedo book and this book. I've done some of them, but if you read the citations, the footnotes in the Supreme Court's ruling in U.S. v. Reynolds, which is the 1953 case that formally established the state secrets privilege in the U.S., you'll notice that a number of them involve naval defense contractors. and I don't think that's an accident. I think it's that there's almost a fundamental tension in societies that are at least rhetorically committed to the norms of liberal capitalism and free markets. There's a tension between the desire to rely on the private sector to meet a lot of defense procurement needs so as not to be a kind of command economy, which historically Britain and the United States have both defined themselves against. There's a tension between that desire to rely on the private sector, which can turn to all of these, liberal capitalist norms and tools to assert their property claims, and then the government's interest in secrecy. And so I think part of what I've tried to do is say that, from the outside, the military industrial complex, and this was certainly the way it was conceptualized in the 1930s when you have all the merchants of death rhetoric taking off and the Nye committee investigations and so forth, is that there's this kind of, it's a well-oiled machine, the military industrial complex that works very well for both sides. And there's a lot to that. And I show in one of the chapters of the book, like why it looks that way to an outsider and why the outsider is not wrong to think that. But at the same time, there's also intense tensions within the military industrial complex between the industrial side and the military side. And so I think that the Pollen and Isherwood story, and actually not just their story, but I also tell the stories of other American firms that became involved in the fire control industry in the interwar period. I think there's a much bigger story there about the military industrial complex and about the kind of history of the national security state, and actually in particular of nuclear secrecy. That's one of the things I talk about in the book. Atomic secrecy is in some ways the apex of national security secrecy, but you can actually find a lot of precedents for the kind of tools that were used for nuclear secrecy in naval contracting in earlier decades, and not just in the US, but actually going back to Britain in the 19th century. So I actually, one of the ways I've kind of explained to myself what I'm trying to do is to recast the history of the national security state and of nuclear secrecy, not only as the beginning of a new story in the mid 20th century United States with World War II and the Manhattan Project, but also as the end of an older story that's about naval technology and goes back to the 19th century and to Britain.
No, that's definitely a useful contribution to highlight on a kind of conceptual and historical front. So thank you for adding that in. I wonder if, as sort of a few final points, that feels like it's closing off a lot of our discussion, but there are a few other threads I'd like to tie off, please. Perhaps briefly, but let's throw them in. First off, are there any technologies that come later that we should understand as being influenced by what Pollen was doing, given that you've just told us about kind of the influence influence on the sort of legal side, the policy side, that sort of thing. What about on the technological front?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I like part of what I tried to do in the book is actually think about naval technology and legal technology, and so we've just covered the contributions that their story makes on the legal technology side, but on the technology side, so to speak. Um, their invention, I think, it very obviously and directly influenced the development of American fire control systems um, into World War II. It's really up until the advent of digital instead of analog computing, and the advent of radar is also a very big deal for fire control. Their system is it. It's the gold standard, and Ford makes a lot of improvements to their system. And so it's not, the development of their system essentially stops in 1913 when the Admiralty pulls development support in favor of Dreyer's system. But it seems pretty clear to me that they're the fundamental design influence on U.S. fire control systems. That's true, I think, of anti-aircraft fire control, not just surface fire control as well. There's a lot of overlap. I think, and this is less of a direct influence and also actually just kind of a hunch. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I have a suspicion that they also influenced American bombsight technology, because bombsights actually combine gyrostabilization and analog computers in much the same way that their system did. They actually invented bomb sights as well as fire control systems. And then I think if you kind of run the clock forward, there's a historian named David Mendel who wrote a wonderful book called Between Human and Machine about kind of control and guidance technologies. And he showed that on the American side, there's a connection between naval fire control systems developed by a company called the Sperry Gyroscope Company, a very important American firm, which actually Hannibal Ford had been an employee of. There are very close connections between Sperry Gyroscope, the instrumentation lab at MIT, a very famous lab, and NASA in the early days of the space program. And so one of the things I show in the book is actually that Pollen and Isherwood had various links with Sperry Gyroscope. And so I think probably their fingerprints are on space guidance. Like, however faint the fingerprints are, I think there's probably like some indirect influence there. Mm-hmm. One of the other things, and this isn't direct influence at all, but that I just find kind of a fascinating analogy, is that even with like the most cutting edge digital technology today, like semiconductors, like it's actually hard to draw a firm line between, or a bright line between like machine tools and instruments when it comes to the manufacture of semiconductors, because the precision required is so insane that the machine tools are almost, they're very much like scientific instruments. And scientific instruments, it's a term of art. There's an incredibly rich and sophisticated literature on the history of instruments making. And of course, Pollen and Isherwood come out of an instruments making world. And they also come out of a printing world. They make linotype machines, and actually semiconductors are printed literally through photolithographic technology, and optics are hugely important. Pollen and Isherwood also had owned a share of an optics firm. So there's all these really interesting analogies, I think, between kind of late 19th, early 20th century analog computing and digital computing today. So I think that those are the main influences and analogies between what Pollen and Isherwood did and what came after.
Very interesting to think about. Thank you for drawing those lines for us. And I wonder then, as my final question, this is obviously something that you are very intrigued by, right? You've mentioned kind of
Yep.
throughout this the ways in which this book, but also the book before that, are kind of drawing on some of the same sorts of things. So, I mean, I have to ask, what's the next project?
That's an excellent question, which I would give you the answer to as soon as I know it myself.
Fair
I'm not.
enough.
I'm not sure. There's numerous books I would love to write actually, but I know I definitely want to keep researching like the nexus of intellectual property and government secrecy. And I also definitely want to keep researching the Anglo-American relationship and the transition from the Pax Britannica to the Pax Americana, which is something I write about a lot in the book. And one of the arguments I tried to make is that the US was doing to Britain pretty much all the same things in terms of the acquisition of foreign technology and IP by fair means or foul. The same things to Britain that the US accuses China of doing to it today. And so I've written some, not only in the book, but in articles about kind of trying to rethink the way the transition from the Pax Britannica to the Pax Americana is normally narrated, as fairly friendly, the special relationship, and I see it as actually quite rivalrous and contested.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely want to keep exploring that too. Um,
Well, those sound like some very interesting topics to keep poking at. So I'm very curious to see what comes of that next. But of course, while you are exploring and deciding, listeners can read the book we've been talking about, titled Analog Superpowers: How 20th Century Technology Theft Built the National Security State, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2024. Kate, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me and for reading the book so carefully. I appreciate it.